Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Lord's Day Holy Reading. We're glad you could join us, and we're ready to go ahead and get started.
All right, welcome everybody here in our community and online. We're doing starting week 30 of a Treatise of Self-Denial by Thomas Manton. And we're on a section here of 5 points. Last week, it's the fourth branch against self-seeking overall, and he said, by which I mean a denial of our own ends, for God must be the utmost end of all the creatures' actings. And the last week we did number 1, what this self-seeking is. Today, Lord willing, we'll do 2, 3, and 4, the evidences, how it bewrays itself. 3, how necessary it is to handle it. And 4, how difficult it is to deny this part of self. And so just looking at today in an overview fashion, he's very adamant. Self-seeking, very serious. Self-seeking is no small matter. These are all taken from the reading today. Self-seeking is no small matter. Self-seeking is a dangerous and heinous evil, and heinous includes the meanings hateful and odious. Self-seeking abuseth God exceedingly. And he says, there is nothing that alienates a man from God so much as self-seeking, which is pretty stark. And carnal professors, by default, are enemies to the cross, and to the cross of Christ. He says that a couple times, and that's from Philippians 3, verse 18. We'll have a reading from Gill and from Matthew Henry included, because this section is really relatively short. Another aspect is talking about carnal professors being actual enemies to the cross. Another exact same meaning of enemy is adversary. If you look in Webster's, both are the same. Adversary even goes further. It's one who has enmity at heart and may not even, and I add this, and may not, well, I wrote all this. One who has enmity at heart, that's from the Webster's. And we know from experience, people may not even know it and might actually believe the exact opposite, which is one of the adversary, the devil's greatest delusions. And the Lord showed me this actually today, which explains the heart of that, and that's Romans 10, verses 1 through 3. Brethren, my heart, and this is Paul, obviously in Romans, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. So that's basically a big part of self-seeking. A lot of times people don't even see it that way. They think they're doing what's right. So we start off with secondly, and that is to give you the signs by which a self-seeker may be discovered. The best judge is his own conscience, is our own conscience. Yet, he says to revive guilt. We're going to go a note or two here. Number 1, a man is guilty of this self-seeking when he puts himself upon the profession of godliness out of the promise of some worldly advantage. And he goes to Genesis 34, verses 22 through 24. Observe the argument of the Shechemites. They would yield to circumcision upon this supposition. Included in that is, quote, shall not all their cattle and all that they have be ours? And I'll go to those actual verses. This is the story of Dinah, the daughter and the Shechemites, Shechem violating her, and the horrible way that was all handled by Jacob's sons. Anyway, I have a reading on that, and we'll actually get into the story, the commentary on Dinah, because it's really good for the children, I think, to hear that. Only herein will the men consent unto us for to dwell with us, to be one people, if every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised. Shall not their cattle and their substance and every beast of theirs be ours? Only let us consent unto them, and they will dwell with us. And unto Hamor and unto Shechem his son hearkened all that went out of the gate of his city, and every male was circumcised, all that went out of the gate of his city. So Mr. Manton is talking there about profession of godliness is totally, ultimately shallow. And that he says that's a brutish argument, and yet this is very usual, especially in times of public changes. So Matthew Henry on chapter 34 about this story, and again, as I read this, I thought about going ahead and reading about Dinah. Matthew Henry says, "At this chapter begins the story of Jacob's afflictions in his children, which were very great, and are recorded to show, number one, the vanity of this world. That which is dearest to us may prove our greatest vexation, and we may meet with the greatest crosses in those things of which we said, quote, this same shall comfort us, unquote. Two, the common griefs of good people. Jacob's children were circumcised, were well taught, and prayed for, and had very good examples set them, yet some of them proved very untoward. Quote, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, unquote. Grace does not run in the blood, and yet the interrupting of the entail of grace does not cut off the entail of profession and visible church privileges. Nay, Jacob's sons, though they were his grief in some things, yet were all taken into covenant with God. In this chapter, we have one, Dinah debauched, two, the circumcision of the Shechemites, and and then the last one is the perfidious and bloody revenge with Simeon, which Simeon and Levi took upon them. But the first one is Dinah. Dinah was, for aught that appears, Jacob's only daughter, and we may suppose her therefore the mother's fondling and the darling of the family, and yet she proves neither a joy nor a credit to them. For those children seldom prove either the best or the happiest that are most indulged. She is reckoned now but 15 or 16 years of age when she here occasioned so much mischief. Observe, number one, her vain curiosity, which exposed her to everything that was going to happen. She went out, perhaps unknown to her father, but by the connivance of her mother, to see the daughters of the land, verse 1. Probably it was at a ball or on some public day. Being an only daughter, she thought herself solitary at home. And I added, probably restless and dissatisfied, having none of her own age and sex to converse with, and therefore she, in her mind, must needs go abroad to divert herself, to keep off melancholy, which is sadness, and to accomplish herself by conversation better than she could in her father's tents. Note, it is a very good thing for children to love home. It is parents' wisdom to make it easy to them, and children's duty then to be easy in it. Her pretense to do what she was going to do, which pretense is a feigned or false deceptive reason, was to see the daughters of the land, to see how they dressed and how they danced and what was fashionable among them. She went to see, yet that was not all. She went to be seen too. She went to see the daughters of the land, but it may be with some thoughts of the sons of the land too. But I doubt she went to get acquaintance with those Canaanites, the way it fell out, and to learn their way. But note, The pride and vanity of young people betray them into many snares. 2, the loss of her honor by this means. Verse 2, Shechem, the prince of the country, but a slave to his own lusts, took her and forced her to be with him. It should seem not so much by force as by surprise. Note, great men think they may do anything, and what more mischievous than untaught and ungoverned youth? See what came of Dinah's gadding, which was a word meaning rambling and roving about. See what came of Dinah's rambling and roving about. Young women must learn to be chaste, keepers at home. These properties are put together, Titus 2:5. For those that are not keepers at home expose their chastity. Dinah went abroad to look about her, but if she had looked about her as she ought, she would not have fallen into this snare. Note, the beginning of sin is as the letting forth of water. How great a matter does a little fire kindle? We should therefore carefully avoid all occasions of sin and approaches to it. Number 3, the court Shechem made to her after he had defiled her. This was fair and commendable and made the best of what was bad. He loved her, not as Amnon in 2 Samuel 13:15, and he engaged his father, Shechem's father, to make a match for him with her. Verse 4, the tidings brought to poor Jacob. Verse 5, as soon as his children grew up, they began to be a grief to him. Let not godly parents that are lamenting the miscarriages of their children think their case singular or unprecedented. The good man, Jacob, held his peace as one astonished, that knows not what to say. Or he said nothing for fear of saying anything amiss, as David in Psalms 39. He smothered his resentments, Jacob, lest if he had suffered them to break out, they might have transported him into any decencies or indecencies maybe. Or it should seem he had left the management of his affairs very much, too much, I doubt, in parentheses, left the management of his affairs very much to his sons, and he would do nothing without them. Or at least he knew they would make him uneasy if he did, they having shown themselves of late upon all occasions bold, forward, and assuming. Note, things never go well when the authority of a parent runs low in a family. Let every man bear rule in his own house and have his children in subjection with all gravity. And I'll just add one verse here about what, to finish up what Mr. Manton was referring to overall. Jacob's sons, when they heard of the injury done to Dinah, showed a very great resentment of it, influenced perhaps rather by jealousy for the honor of the family rather than a sense of virtue. Many are concerned at the shamefulness of sin that never lay to heart the sinfulness of it. So, thank you. It is usual for men to follow a dying church for a legacy as vultures for a carcass. The change may be good, but their end is stark naught. It was a complaint made. I'll read the Latin, non pietate everturum idola sed avaritia, which means you have destroyed idols, but let covetousness stand. There may be, and I looked that up, so that was a good thing to see what it meant. There may be a great idol in their own hearts. Men may follow Christ, quote, for the loaves. John 6:26. Jesus answered them and said, verily, verily, I say unto you, you seek me, not because ye saw the miracles, but because ye did eat of the loaves and were filled. They did not value his person, but they would live at ease and be fed with miracles. Another Latin sentence here, vix diligetur Jesus propter jessum. Seldom is Jesus valued for his own sake. Men seek temporal conveniences in the practice and profession of the gospel, ease, peace, wealth, credit, and so they appropriate Jesus Christ to secular uses. It was an inestimable mercy that God should send his son, yet they look no further than the loaves. Number 2, when a man, subpoint 2 here under secondly, when a man cannot, okay, again, these are signs by which a self-seeker may be discovered. When a man cannot endure to be crossed for his religion. Carnal professors are, quote, enemies to Christ's cross. Philippians 3:18, and I will read 17 and 19 also here in a second. Their lamp will not burn unless it be fed with the oil of praise and profit. And this is this might be the best John Gill I've ever read. I mean, a lot of times he's pretty just stark in his assessments, which are very good, but I think he adds a little more to this. John Gill on Philippians 3:17 through 19. Brethren, I'll go ahead and Brethren, be followers together of me, and mark them which walk so as ye have us for an ensample. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose end is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things. Brethren, be followers together of me, not that the apostle set up himself as the head of a party, which is what he always blamed in others. He did not assume a dominion over the faith of men or seek to lord it over God's heritage, nor did he desire any to be followers of him any further than he was a follower of Christ. And what he was, whether in doctrine or practice, he desires to be followed in. And here he has a particular regard to what went before that he had talked about already in the Word. Concerning reckoning what was gain as loss, accounting all things but dung, in comparison of the knowledge of Christ, looking to his righteousness, Christ's righteousness alone for justification, disclaiming perfection, forgetting things behind, reaching towards things before, and pressing to the mark for the prize, and walking according to the rule of God's word, in which things he had some that followed him, who were his spiritual children, and to whom he had been useful in conversion and edification. And he would therefore have these Philippians followers of him together with them, and which contains in it an encouraging reason or argument, since others were followers of him, or together with one another. He was desirous that one and all of them might follow him, that they might all go in the same way, confess the same truth, be found in the practice of the same things, worship the Lord with one consent, pursue the same ends, and draw all the same way, and so be as the church was, like a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariot. And mark them which walk so, the second sentence, as the apostle did, and those that were followers of him. These he would have others mark, observe them, attentively look to, not as others who cause offenses and divisions and obey not the word, in order to shun, avoid, and keep no company with, but to imitate and follow, and next to Christ, mark, to make use of them as inferior ones, inferior to Christ, as ye have us for an ensample, or type. Believers should be ensamples, one to another, especially ministers of the word. Pastors of churches are not to be lords over God's heritage, but to be ensamples to the flock. 1 Peter 5:3, in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, in purity, as the apostle exhorts Timothy. And in these things they are to be followed by believers. Philippians 3:18, for many walk, and it's for many walk otherwise is the Syriac version, but for many walk in the King James Version, and which truly explains the words and gives the sense. They walked not as the apostle and his followers. They walked as men, as carnal men, according to the course of the world, after their ungodly lusts, or according to the rites and ceremonies of the Mosaic dispensation, and uprightly, and according to the truth of the gospel. And there were many that walked so. That really stuck out to me more as going over this I had a lot of opportunity to read this week. And I think we sometimes forget that that may have been the rule all throughout our history, all throughout the world. There's been many that have walked that way, and because it goes along with Matthew 7:13, enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat, and few that find it. The road both of profaneness and error is a broad one, and many walk therein, which makes it the more dangerous. The examples of many have great force, though a multitude is not to be followed to do evil. The conversation of a great part of professors is not to be imitated. The few names in Sardis that have not defiled their garments with error or immorality should be marked for ensamples. Revelation 3:4, and the majority shunned, of whom I have told you often. Paul talked about this often. So it's very serious, both when present among them by word of mouth and when absent from them by writing. For the apostle was a faithful watchman and monitor to this church and to all the churches, the care of which lay upon him. And diligent he was to warn them against false teachers, whose doctrines and practices he knew were of pernicious consequence. And now I tell you even weeping, which is self-evident how serious when Paul uses the word weeping. He's talking about this in a weeping way, partly on account of those evil men whose state and condition, notwithstanding their profession, faults, was very bad, and partly on account of the glory of God in Christ. He's weeping for that and for the other, and the honor of religion, which suffered much through them, and also on account of the Philippians, lest they should be drawn aside by them, and because they had taken so little notice of his frequent cautions and advice, and that they might the better know the men he spoke of and avoid them. He describes them by the following characters: that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ. Not that, though they might be Jews, they were like the unbelieving Jews. There was a difference there, because the Jews were open and implacable enemies of a crucified Christ, called Jesus accursed and anathematized him and his followers, and to whom the preaching of Christ crucified was an offense and stumbling block. For these were professors of Christ, the others, and pretended to preach Christ. They're more insidious, and him crucified. Nor were they such heretics that denied that Christ really assumed human nature, and they didn't deny he was crucified and died, and they affirmed that all this was affirmed that all this was only an appearance, or that an image was hung upon the cross for him, or Simon the Cyrenian was crucified in his room, as some have thought, which was the heresy of Simon Magus and his disciple Basilides. Nor is the sense that they were averse to the crucifixion of the affections with the lusts. Though this seems to be their true character, they weren't openly disavowing that, since they were sensual and minded earthly things. But the meaning is that they disliked, down in their being, the cross of Christ. They were unwilling to take it up for his sake and follow him. They studied all ways and means to shun it. They ingratiated themselves into the affections of the unbelieving Jews by complying with the ceremonies of the law and bearing hard upon the apostle and his ministry, that so they might not suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. And besides, by enjoining circumcision and an observance of the law as necessary to salvation, they, as much as in them lay, made void the efficacy of the cross and death of Christ, and made that in him unprofitable and of no effect to the souls of men, and were both doctrinally and practically enemies of the cross of Christ. And so all such professors of Christ, who walk not according to the gospel, though they are not open and direct enemies to the gospel, which is the preaching of the cross, yet they are secret and indirect ones, and oftentimes do more mischief to it by their lives than the keenest adversaries of it can by their pens, whose end is destruction, everlasting destruction, the destruction of both body and soul in hell. and whose god is their belly. The belly was the god of the Cyclops. They sacrificed to none but to themselves, and to the greatest of the gods, their own belly, as money is the covetous man's god, whom he loves, adores, and puts his confidence in. So the belly is the god of the sensualist, the epicure, and the voluptuous person. He has more regard for service of that than for the service of God. And of this complexion were these professors. They were lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. All their pretensions to religion, to Christ and his gospel, were only to serve themselves, their own bellies, and not the Lord Jesus Christ, not to do good to the souls of men, or their belly may be said to be their God, because they placed religion in observance of meats and drinks, either allowed or forbidden in the law of Moses, etc., and whose glory is in their shame, in their evil practices committed in secret, of which it was a shame to speak, in their hidden things of dishonesty, crafty walking and deceitful handling of the word of God, which were vile and scandalous, who mind earthly things. The Arabic version renders it who entertain earthly opinions, and some by earthly things understand the ceremonies of the law, called the elements and rudiments of the world, which these teachers were fond of, and were very diligent to inculcate and urge the observance of. Though Gill says rather worldly things, such as honor, glory, and popular applause, wealth, and riches are meant. So it just really stuck out to me, the seriousness in a deeper way that this all was, and how serious it was to Paul as he wrote about it. Going back to subpoint 2, a godly man is contented to be neglected and abased for Christ, and yet is still satisfied with his work. He references 2 Samuel 2, verse 22, I will be yet more vile, where David is replying to Michal, the daughter of Saul, who's making fun of him and actually despising him. Blessed be God, I can suffer this for his sake. A horse that hath a nail in his foot may travel well on soft ground, but in a hard and gravelly way there he halteth. So men, as long as religion is accompanied with conveniency, then they may like it, but are, quote, enemies to the cross of Christ. Then hirelings will soon prove changelings. Job verses chapter 2, verse 9, dost thou retain thine integrity? When men are delicate and tender and cannot endure the cross, it is a sign they had other aims of credit and profit in their profession. Subpoint 3, by envying others in the same profession, you bewray your self-seekerness. We should rejoice in their gifts and graces, and be glad that God may be honored by others as well as ourselves. But proud men would shine alone. They envy the gifts and graces of others. This is a sure note of self-seeking. It is not grace they look after, but carnal advantage. This is the practice of the elder brother, which Christ taxeth in the 15th of Luke, the elder brother of the prodigal. He that is truly gracious desires that others may partake of the same grace, for he knows that God is thereby the more glorified. But when we are covetous of reputation and design our own honor, then the fewer, the greater is our advantage. These men know that their stream will suffer some loss when it is diffused into so many channels. It is notable that of the apostle in Galatians 5:6, saying, let us not be desirous of vainglory, envying one another, provoking one another. Self-seeking puts men upon passions and envy. They are touchy because they are jealous of their own interest, and they are envious because they think the commonness of gifts and graces detracteth from their esteem. Thirdly, to show you how necessary it is that you should practice and that we should preach this part of self-denial, how necessary it is appeareth enough already. It's pretty obvious. But yet further it may be added that you should regard it, number 1, partly that you may not rob God of his essential honor. There is nothing that alienates a man from God so much as self-seeking. Devotion and service are preserved when we make God our paymaster. But when men look to the world and the approbation of men, they do not care for God. And it's very evident. It's very stark, and it's one is 180 from the other. You're looking for approval from men constantly. That's your life's goal, and then you do not care for God. Quote, if any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. 1 John 2:16. Christ is troublesome to such, not welcome, because of the interest he hath in their conscience. Brethren, it is no small matter I am speaking about. Self-seeking abuseth God exceedingly. It is one of his prerogatives to be the utmost end of the creature's being and operation, and you usurp that which is proper to God when you self-seek. When self hath a preeminence above him, God is kept out of the throne. Pharaoh only reserved this to be greater in the throne than Joseph. You may do much that is good, clothe the naked, feed the hungry, give your body to be burnt, but all this while self can be greater than God on the throne. 2, this is very necessary, that you may not rob him of his tribute from the creatures. God hath given us many things. Only he reserved this, quote, my glory will I not give to another. And that is from Isaiah 42, verse 8. I am the Lord, that is my name, and my glory will I not give to another, neither my praise to graven images. He hath given us the prophet, P-R-O-F-I-T, that we may give him the glory. God hath given us a lease of the comforts of the world. Only this he hath reserved as his rent and acknowledgement, that he will be glorified in all our actions and honored in all our blessings. God hath made us and hath a right and title to us. He that planted the tree hath a right in the fruit. God that made us certainly expects some fruit from us. God gave us talents to this purpose, or rather lends us. We are but servants to employ the talents to our master's use. A Christian hath given up himself to God, a living sacrifice. Romans 12, verse 1. You are not your own. God hath a right and title to you. Therefore do not rob him of his glory. A sacrifice under the law was no more his that offered it, but the Lord's. Romans 12:1, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And reasonable service include the deeper word of that is latreo, which means worship and ministry. So your worship and your ministry is your reasonable service. And as it is necessary, you should practice it. So it is necessary we should press it again and again upon you. Self-seeking is a close evil, as well as a dangerous and heinous one. 2 things I observe. Number 1, that the greatest self-seeking usually is carried on under the color of self-denial, as the Gibeonites put on old shoes and old garments to make a league with Joshua. So many pretend mortification and self-denial to endear themselves to others for worldly profit and advantage, as those the apostle speaks of in 2 Corinthians 11, that to gain credit, entrance, and applause, they would take no maintenance, because they were making money a lot of other ways. All the carnal designs of men have been carried on under a pretense and a veil of religion. Herod, under a pretense of worship, would have Christ to be destroyed as a baby. Matthew 2, verse 8, and Jezebel proclaims a fast to destroy Naboth, 1 Kings 21:9. So Simeon and Levi pressed the Shechemites to be circumcised out of revenge. A crocodile weepeth, and then maketh a prey. Carnal ends are often shrouded under religious pretenses. Subpoint 2, that we are more apt to accuse others out of envy than to reflect upon ourselves. Many think self-seeking is a sin only incident to them that are called to public employment, either in the church or commonwealth. Well, it's not. We may warn others, but we cannot judge of them for self-seeking lies in the aim of the spirit at times, and is liable to the censure and judgment of God alone. When the action was fair, Job 1 verse 9, it was Satan's accusation. Doth Job serve God for naught? You should not out of envy accuse others, but reflect on thy own heart. We may not have such opportunity as they to enrich ourselves. He's speaking of people that have those intentions. We may not have such opportunity as they to enrich themselves, and that may put us upon envy. But they would, if they had the opportunity, they would. But art not thou a self-seeker so far as thou canst reach within thy grasp? Oh, the envy that is in our hearts, and the pride that is in our prayers and conferences, which we do not take notice of. Wouldst thou be thought well of in thy place, as Simon Magus would be some great one? Thou mayest be guilty of simony, as they may be guilty of hypocrisy, bribery, and purloining from the public, which is stealing. And fourthly, to end up today, it is a difficult and hard piece of self-denial. It is natural to us. All men, quote, all men seek their own things, Philippians 2 verse 21. All our mark naturally is at some aim of our own, at our own profit and credit in the natural. It is very hardly laid aside, for base and unworthy desires are very importunate, and they do recoil upon us, or can, after mortification, and after resolutions to the contrary. We often find that we begin well, we aim at the glory of God, it is our habituated aim, but thoughts of pride grow upon us in the very middle of the action, or else after it is ended. It is an impudent sin. That's an interesting word. Impudent, shameless, lacking modesty, bold, with contempt of others, and Webster's included. When we behold an angel and do not fear, that is to be impudent. So it is an impudent sin that will assault us again and again. So we need to be on our guard and look to the Lord, obviously, for our strength in that. That's the end for today. Lord willing, next week we will do fifthly. There will be, Lord willing, 3 parts to that, and then this study will be over. So God show us his teachings for us today in our spirit. I'm glad you can make it.
Amen. Thank the Lord. All right, everyone on the line, we're glad you could join us, and go in God's meekness, and Lord willing, we will talk to you again soon.